When I was 15, I would be exposed to something else. We moved to Eugene, Oregon from Michigan. It was a cultural shock to me. My first thoughts upon arriving was I no longer have to deal with the gangs and their extreme violence. That was common in Michigan. The second was the amazement of the hippies there. The third, no one seemed to know or care that I was Polish. I didn't experience one incident of dislike because I was Polish. That was not the case in the last two places I lived. In the years before we moved to Eugene, it was a few times given the award for the most livable city in the U.S. It was at the southern edge of the Willamette Valley. The high-rising Cascade Mountains, permanently snow-capped, were immediately to the east, and the Coast Range just to the west. Both mountain ranges were covered with thick forests of many types of trees, including the Douglas firs, some of the tallest trees in the world. They have reached known heights up to a few feet short of 400 feet, or about 120 meters. The city was an earlier developer of a massive bike path system, as well as running trails. The winters were very mild, more like areas of the deep south of the U.S. than latitudes that far north. I've defined realism and individualism culturally in the last episodes. In my experience, it means everything is black and white in their thinking. It dismisses what it does not understand. Magical realism considers what it doesn't understand. I have taken these terms from novels, art, and film. I then have used it in viewing my experiences in the places I have lived. Oregon still had a realism feeling similar to the Midwest in that things were mostly black and white. There was almost no community in Oregon, and even less than in Indiana and Michigan. It didn't have nearly the rigidity that Michigan and Indiana had, but I would still identify my experience as one of realism. Many people were transplants to Oregon from other parts of the U.S., which I think accounted for less of a community as there was less of a history. I've read there was not a bigger hippie enclave than Eugene. I appreciate that the hippie movement questioned things, and though I found that they didn't judge who a person was, they were every bit as judgmental as Michigan and Indiana if someone didn't have the exact philosophical views they did. I found this also to be true of the liberal professionals and academics there. It seemed these two groups were often very bitter against anyone who didn't have their perspective. Maybe just bitter in general. And I can't say I know why. There were women who certain people called feminine Nazis, who viewed that all the world's problems were because of white men. If you were a white male, they thought of you as being completely detrimental and worthless to the world. I think the hippies tried to be more like magical realism culturally, but in my opinion, failed. I believe they wanted it to be very communal, of tradition, and to be open-minded, but in many ways were not. I did appreciate their concept of being free. The school district I lived in was a very average one. I'd come from school districts in Michigan and Indiana, which were exceptional. The overall message in Indiana and Michigan seemed clear. My high school in Oregon wasn't nearly as concerned about one's overall education. If you wanted to do well in school, that was nice, but if not, that was okay too. The district didn't have the harshness that Michigan and Indiana did. It wasn't so judgmental on your talents and academic ability. I was in National Honor Society and was very involved in student leadership. I decided in my last 2 years of high school I would take a number of independent study classes and study what I wanted to study. I'm sure such a thing would not have been allowed in Michigan or Indiana. I suspect there was a large difference between non-inner city schools of Michigan, Indiana, and those of Oregon. My experience in Michigan and Indiana was there was a very strong adherence to the fundamentals of education. Oregon didn't have this. There was an exceptional school in the south part of Eugene. This is the school in which the academics and well-educated liberals sent their kids. It was truly exceptional, but also where the very best students seemed to have frequently experimented in drug usage. They do use them under control, which means it didn't seem to affect other areas of their lives. The 3 years of high school at my Eugene high school was kind of a waste of time. The Michigan high school I started at, or school in the south of Eugene, would have expanded my thinking skills. There was a great appreciation for the outdoors in Eugene. That I liked. There was a lot of people into hiking, mountain climbing, kayaking, rock climbing, and other outdoor sports. It was a different mentality for the outdoors. If someone in Michigan and Indiana were into the outdoors, then most likely they were into fishing and hunting. In Oregon, it was more about an appreciation for the natural forces of nature. There was an anti-wealth perspective that was common, and it often came from those who had grown up wealthy. What was funny to me is they were quick to judge those who were not from wealth about being materialistic, but they themselves still held on to selective parts of materialism. An example of this is I once went out with a lady who put me down for having a somewhat new, moderately priced car, and yet she had $40,000 horses, which were quite expensive to care for. She was from extreme East Coast wealth, but she was rebelling against that and living the simple life. She, like others, would move about as far away as they could from their families, which Eugene seemed like a good place to them. The core of Eugene was certainly not blue collar, but outside of Eugene, Portland, and a couple of small pockets, the state was almost entirely blue collar and mostly dependent on the timber industry. Eugene had a twin city named Springfield. Springfield was very blue collar and was the town which Matt Groening based his TV cartoon The Simpsons, a satire on American life. He obviously wasn't too impressed with Springfield. Oregon has been the state with the greatest timber production since the late 1930s. Timber production decreased after the late 1970s with all states. Eugene has long been known as the running capital of the world. One of its nicknames is Track City, USA. University of Oregon has 32 national championships in cross country and track and field. Many Olympians and world-class athletes train there. A couple of years ago, Hayward Field in Eugene, University of Oregon's track stadium, was renovated for $270 million. Hayward Field has hosted the NCAA track and field or college national championships 18 times, the U.S. national championships 8 times, the U.S. Olympic trials 7 times, and in 2022 they hosted the World Athletics Championship, which the World Championships in track and field are a part of. This was the first time in which it has been held in the United States. Eugene is also where the shoe manufacturer Nike started. It was started by the University of Oregon coach Bill Bowerman and track team member Phil Knight. Phil Knight has since donated more than $1 billion to the University of Oregon. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe and like, as that is how YouTube decides to send it on to others or not. Have a wonderful day, and see you in the next episode.